Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Peter Davis, managing partner of Interplay. I'm on a mission to help entrepreneurs advance society, and this podcast is part of that effort. Today, we're going to have a very special conversation with my partner, Chris Zhang, who's the CIO and head of the family office at Interplay. Now, Chris's background is particularly unique in the topic we're going to cover, which is the rise of China, because he was actually born and raised in China. Chris came over to the States when he was maybe 16 or 17, speaking literally no English. You'll hear more about his background as we kind of get into this conversation, but he breezed right through Penn, did a double major, graduated 6 months early, was one of the top performing derivatives traders at Morgan Stanley. So when you hear what you're going to hear about the Chinese culture and discipline, you can hear it in the context of his relative success in America. Chris has been here for most of his life now, and he is very much culturally and integrated as an American. He's an American citizen. And so he's very much speaking from the perspective of an American who is going back to visit a homeland. Now, the background for this story, which is going to kind of lead into what you're going to hear, is Chris used to visit his family once a year, going back from the States to China, and then COVID hit. And so it's been 4 long years since he's gone back. And I think being away from the country for a longer period made the change that's happened in the interim more startling. So he noticed a lot of change had happened in 4 years, and he was shocked by it. So he's going to take us through what he experienced. And the big headline, which I think Americans kind of know is coming at this point, we all know there's an if and when China is at kind of economic parity with the US, and then may or may not surpass us. The headline is, it's probably already happened. It's probably now. And so we need to, one, understand that and throw away some of our now dated stereotypes that China makes inferior technology or they're not operating at the same level. I think that's just the headline you're going to hear from Chris is from his experience, that's no longer the case. Part 2 is whether or not they're a little behind, a little ahead, or at parity, it doesn't matter. We are now operating in a world where it's an oligopoly. America is no longer the leading and exclusive world power, and we're sharing that seat with another organization. And so all of the ways we operate internally, think about our international politics, everything has to adapt. There's pros and cons to all of this. But the goal of this isn't to make anyone afraid. It's more to make people aware. My great hope in all of this is there's a lot of sword rattling between the two countries right now. Just because another country has economic success doesn't mean we need to go to war with them. There are a lot of differences in social policy and human rights, in values. My hope is we can find more ways to reconcile and live together versus try to kill each other for really no productive end. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to a conversation with Chris Zhang to get a very unique American perspective of what's happening in China. All right, Chris, got a big day today. I'm excited about this one. We've been talking about little snippets and bits and pieces of this story since you've been back from your trip. But to get it all woven together and to share some of your insights and have a real deeper dialogue, I think is going to be fascinating. So, all right, well, take it away. Share your perspective on the latest news out of China.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. Let me start with my own disclaimers this time. The first thing I will say to everyone is, first, I'm American. I share the vast majority of the political beliefs and values here. And I've spent a big chunk of my life in China, growing up there. I left at a young age. So I've really, my political beliefs and my value sets are more Western than let's say, versus the ones in China. The second thing I will say is I'm not a historian of China, and my family does not have any sort of insider access to the government. We're sort of the definition of upper middle class. And my goal today is really just to be as factual and as objective as possible. but know that there's going to be some level of subjectivity to things we'll be talking about, because I'll be sharing through my own experiences what I saw as an observer, having spent, like I said, half of my life effectively living in China. Lastly, I do run an RIA, and the SEC rules are very strict. So know that if I do end up mentioning some companies, I'm simply using them to illustrate a point. And by no means I'm advocating for that the audience should buy or sell the company securities. With that, let's start the chat.
That's very clear and helpful context, because I think there's going to be folks who hear some of this stuff and try to discredit it or just write it off as saying, well, he's from there, he's biased, and there's always that. But it's not, the context, I think, helps clarify that you're tending to communicate here. I think it might be helpful for folks, before we dive into your recent experiences in China, just to start with a little bit of your background, so people can have that context and the lens through which you're looking.
Sounds good. I spent the first 16 and a half years. I was born in China and I was raised there until I was 16 and a half. Afterwards, I came to the States for education, and later on became a U.S. citizen. I've been a U.S. citizen for over 10 years. In terms of my experience in China, I've given a lot of thought about this, and I really trying to figure out the best way to deliver and describe what it was like. And it turns out, I think the best possible way for me to do this is actually just through a snapshot of my middle school, let's say a day or a week, and what I was doing there. And I think that really encapsulates my whole experience. So if you don't mind, let me dive in and sort of describe to you, like, sort of from a first person perspective, what that was like.
Yeah, do it.
This is, first of all, a very special chapter in my life, and perhaps this is when I was age 13 to 16, right? So this period, thinking back, is probably what shaped my understanding of sort of meaning and happiness in life more than any other. So I was in China at the time, attending this so-called military academy / boarding school in Henan, my home province, which is about the size of the state of New York, but with 110 million people. The school I attended was ranked first out of 5,500 secondary schools in the province. So, smart kids, very competitive to get in, you get the idea. But at this point, if you're picturing sort of fancy prep schools in Connecticut or Upper East Side, let me help you sort of destroy that mental image a little bit. The boarding school is situated about an hour and a half away from the city center, where everyone lives. Every day, the wake up bell is at 6 a.m. sharp. Okay, just first of all, you have to really think back maybe what you were doing back when you're age 13 to 16. The wake up bell for me was 6 a.m. sharp. We would then have exactly 15 minutes to fold our bedding into this perfect rectangular box, put on our clothes, clean up, run down 4 foot floors, and sprint a quarter mile to this outdoor track area. All that in 15 minutes. What happens if you're late by a few seconds? You lose 10 points. So what happens if you lose 100 points? You get kicked out of school forever. Okay, that's literally the system.
100 points in 1 year. So
Correct.
If you have 10 slip-ups by a few seconds, you're out.
You're out. That's the deal. And after taking attendance, rain or shine, we would then do our 1 mile morning run every morning. It doesn't matter what day of the year that is, in military formation. And then we do breakfast and then classes. Okay, so every morning, so it's just like that. A classroom half the size of a typical classroom in the US would usually host about 70 to 80 kids. And class day would run from 7:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. Okay. At 9:30 p.m., we would then usher back to our dorms, and then 10 p.m. lights out. That's sort of a full day schedule. However, 9 out of 10 days, the amount of sort of daily homework in middle school would be so overwhelming that we would have to basically continue doing them in bed, wearing this so-called sort of like an LED headlamp, sort of pictured like coal miners. That's sort of what it was like. There was no hot water on campus, no showers, no air conditioning. We would have school just like that, 6 days a week. Sunday 5 p.m. to Saturday 6 p.m. And we would exactly have 23 hours every week, not in school. And usually 7 or 8 out of the 23 hours that we spend at home is spent doing weekend homework. So you might ask, like, so how, you're a middle school kid, right? How does the school keep us on our toes academically? Well, we would have those midterms, so monthly midterms across all subjects, over 10 of them. And the school would then sort of total up your scores and rank all students from number 1 to the bottom 1. There are about 800 of us per class. And publish that ranking to all students, all teachers, all parents, and sometimes even local newspapers. So you would then basically know exactly how your intelligence and potential, quote unquote potential, compares to everybody else at all times. Okay, so it's kind of forced you into this fixed mindset. Mark, you're going to say something.
Yeah, so you're describing a pretty militant childhood boarding school dynamic, but you also mentioned this was the number 1 school out of 5,500.
Yep, correct.
Were the other 5,500 schools like this too, or was this the outlier?
I can tell you this is not the outlier. So we were the number 1 mostly because of sort of academic achievement, but in terms of the structure to the school and how you spend your day, the amount of homework, all that is the same. But if I were in your position, I would ask myself, like, for instance, why would anyone want to send their kids there, or why would anyone want their kids go through this kind of experience when they're 13?
Sounds a little too intense.
Exactly.
For my American disposition.
Right. So, well, in a country like China, this is really where I really want to dive in. Education is life. We were part of this one-child policy generation, and better education not only means better life outcome for yourself, but also for your family. So for the vast majority of the population growing up, there's just simply no other way to succeed. That's what my experience was like in China. And it really encapsulates all of it. And basically minimal childhood, forget about out there and playing. You're just studying, 12 hours, 13, 14 hours a day, starting from when you're 10. It's exam after exam, and you're carrying your whole family on your shoulders, right? So I think if you sort of see every person in China through this lens, you kind of maybe have a better understanding of why they are who they are and what kind of value set they might carry. So that was my experience.
Sounds pretty high stakes and like a lot of pressure. Is there?
No.
It sounds superhuman. Did everyone rise up to this? Was there like a high suicide rate? Or was it so, something where this was so pervasive that it was maybe quote unquote normal?
This is very normal. And I would say that from a very young age, this idea that your life is not your own, it's your whole family, it's your whole community that you're living for, is really drilled into you. So frankly, I can tell you definitely a lot of mental health problems from all of that. But suicide rates, as far as, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but as far as I could remember and I could tell, is very, very low. Because you're just kind of have to just carry it through. This is what life is about. And your parents went through this. Why not you? Right? So that's the sort of the mentality that everyone had. That's my experience. And then from that to the US, where I went to sort of Connecticut for a public school, high school, and then later on to UPenn and Columbia for business school. I would say that the hardest period of my life was at when I was in middle school, but also that's also the same period that really taught me a lot about what family means to me, what education means to me, and sort of reset my entire value set. So that's my own subjective experience. I kind of maybe want to talk about more objectively what China was like 25 years ago in numbers, in using statistics. So I looked through, I did some research, and here are some numbers I want to share. The first thing is China's GDP per capita, PPP adjusted, back in 1998.
Can you define PPP, please?
PPP stands for purchasing power parity. So GDP per capita is I think everyone understands, but you really have to adjust that number by PPP, which is really just a basket of goods that, in simple terms, it's sort of your living expense, is your actual living cost, right? It's not enough just to measure what you produce on a per capita level, but also what that means to a day-to-day life, right? How much an apple in China doesn't cost the same in the US. I mean, it could be 1/10 the cost, but you ingest the same amount of calories. So you really have to adjust for that living expense. The GDP per capita, PPP adjusted, back in 1998 in China was $3,000. The world average for the same year was 7,300. So about 40% of the world average. And in the US for the same year was $37,000, right? So China was, I don't know, 1/13, 1/14 of US at the time. And the next thing I would say is healthcare. So I'm just trying to give, sort of a broad spectrum of numbers so people understand what was it like. And you can sort of adjust
the prior stats. What year are you giving the data for? What is
1998? So I just picked a 25 years ago. That's exactly 25 years ago. I just thought that's a good accurate number. This is, by the way, for those of you who probably don't know Chinese history as much, 2001 is when China joined the WTO, and that's when really it's a turning point for Chinese economy, world trade. China officially entered into center stage. So really anything before 2001, it's really a different era. So 1998, I thought was a pretty good year to pick. In terms of healthcare, so I used HAQ, which is Healthcare Access and Quality Index. This is in 1990, close, around the same time. China had a score of 49.5 versus US of 73.7. And just so people understand what this thing measures, it's basically a scale from 0 to 100 that's measuring effectively the death rates from 32 causes of death that could be avoided by timely and effective medical care, right? So it's a proxy for how good the healthcare system is. China at the time was scored at 49.5, and US was 74. So quite a bit of a gap. That's the next thing I want to talk about is education and literacy. So this is a pretty big shocker. So in 1982, China had the Chinese literacy rate was 65%. Okay, so 65% of the population are literate, 79% for men, 51% for women. The Chinese tertiary education or higher education rate in 1990 was 3.4%. Okay, so basically nobody went to sort of college or above. That was what the country was like. The country was mostly a farming state and with some manufacturing capacity, not really self-sufficient, dependent on a lot of international partners. Okay, this is the country, this is the sort of the China I lived in back in the 90s. That's really, I want to paint a picture of what China was like. And that's that. And I really want to talk about sort of the next big topic was what is China like now these days. We can maybe start with some of the same statistics I just mentioned, and then pick a few sort of areas that really sort of shocked me when I recently visited. Let's start with the numbers. So GDP per capita PPP adjusted. Same data. In 2021, China stood at 19.5 thousand, with a little bit of rounding. Versus the world, which is at 18.6. So remember, China was 40% of the world average. Now China has surpassed the world average. The US is at 69. So China, on paper, is still right around 1/3 of what US is currently. But this is the part where we had a chat internally about this. This is not what I felt when I visited. When I visited, just so everyone know, I couldn't visit the country during the pandemic. The country effectively shut its borders from all foreigners. I couldn't even visit family. There's no such thing as a family visit visa. So there's, before the pandemic, I used to visit every year, so I would see these incremental improvements. But there was a gap this time, 4 years to be specific. And what I saw when I visited, recently was shocking to me on multiple fronts. The standard of living, in a nutshell, the standard of living has really, really improved. So when I saw this number, this GDP per capita, PPP adjusted, it didn't really make sense to me. It didn't feel like that Chinese standard of living is about a third of US. In fact, to me, it felt like pretty equal. So then I did some digging. Turns out PPP doesn't adjust for services. Okay, it adjusts for a basket of goods, which is really half of what our life expense is like. It does not adjust for healthcare and childcare. It does not adjust for transportation. It does not adjust for education. It doesn't adjust for a number of things, which you can imagine are a huge component of life expenses in the US. So I tried my best and went in and adjust for that myself. Basically, I'm not going to go through all the numbers here. I think that's a bit more nuanced and detailed. But my conclusion was once I adjusted for just the headline services, childcare, healthcare, transportation, tax differential, savings, the difference now comes down to less than 10% between China and US using this proxy for standard of living. That made more sense to me.
So the 1/3 number we see is misleading because the cost of labor and, in all different parts of their life is lower.
Yes.
And so the average person there, you're saying, is living a very comparable life at this point to an American. So you're in town, and I'm sure it's not the same brand names, but people are jogging in Lululemon, taking their dogs, sitting at brunch. It's the same story.
Yes.
It's no longer this agrarian, there's not enough, medical care situation that you left.
Yes. China, for instance, China has universal healthcare, and you pay nothing effectively. You go for a doctor, you pay on average, the average yearly expense in China for medical related and childcare is $300 US. The same figure in US is more than 20x that. Right. So that's just a simple example. And transportation is a huge one. People commute to work here. That people can pay for gas and trains and subways. In China, all of that is subsidized by the government. And you pay one RMB, which is about 13, 14 cents US, and you can travel anywhere in a city, in a mega city that's 10x the size of Manhattan.
So a way to read this is, these KPIs may not be indicative, but if you look at kind of the social advancement, the technological advancement, the quality of life advancement, China is more or less in the zone of being on par with American standard of living.
Correct. But that's just standard. That's sort of just from a cost perspective, right? I mean, there are other areas to consider. For instance, healthcare, I just mentioned previously. The same index, HAQ index, in 2015, I couldn't find anything more recent than that. But in 2015, which is almost a decade ago, China has gone from 50, remember the score back in 1990, to 74.2. And the US has stayed at 84. So this is almost a decade ago, and China's already within striking distance in terms of quality of healthcare. Right. Some other statistics, crime rate. So that could be a huge part of standard living. By World Population Review, crime rate per 100,000, right? This is all crime rate, violent or not. In China is 30.14. In the US is 47.7. So according to this one statistic, China is safer. But of course, you can question the validity of the data, how it's measured, all these things. According to this one statistic, China is safer. And I frankly felt that way when I was there.
Okay.
Let's talk about infrastructure. This is the big one. I really felt the difference in the level of infrastructure when I was there this time. Specifically when it comes to renewables and transportations, roads, subways, high-speed bullet trains, airports. In numbers, US in 2022 spent over $100 billion in infrastructure. I try to really adjust, make it apple to apple. So by this metric, US spent over $100 billion. In 2022, China spent over 2 trillion US dollars in infrastructure. Now, a lot of that was just so that they can boost the economy because of the pandemic and all that. But that's a 20x difference in infrastructure spending, right? And by the way, not a lot of it didn't go to the simple stuff like building new roads, or a lot of it went to renewable energy. So solar, EVs, like you name it, right? All the sort of technologies that the big powers in the world are competing with each other against, right? It's not just the old technology, it's the new technology that's being built. Related to this, I want to mention private sector, because this is one of the bigger misconceptions, I think, that people think that private sector doesn't exist in China or is small. That is not true. More than 50% of GDP from China came from private sector, and more than 80% of the employment from China came from private sector. And in infrastructure alone, over 90% of it is outsourced to private sector, right? So there's a huge collaboration between the government and private sector, just like in the US.
How do those ratios compare to the States in terms of private sector employment?
Oh, of course, the States is definitely way ahead, right? I mean, you can. I don't know. I don't have this exact statistic. I couldn't find it, the Apple one, but if you tell me that the States have over 95% GDP in private sector, I will believe that. I think that's a reasonable assumption. But China is just as big in terms of private sector spending and contribution, right? So that's the part I want to just adjust people's mindset on. There's a huge and blossoming private sector in China.
Right, because it might be half, but the population's 3 or 4 times larger.
Yes, right. And the opportunity set as well, right? That's if you're an immigrant, you're trying to weigh in your head where to go and where to start a company, throw away everything else, policy, right? Like in terms of the opportunity set, China is huge.
Right.
So that's life in China now in numbers, but maybe, I think where we should go next is really pick a few specific sectors based on what I saw this time when I visited, and really just give you a sense what the current lifestyle is like in China. So as I mentioned, I just came back from China. In fact, I visited, and my hometown is Zhengzhou, Henan, which is sort of this, in US newspapers, it's actually known as the iPhone city, because that's where Foxconn has the biggest factory on the planet, where over 70% of the world's iPhone is produced. Over 85 or 90% of the iPhones in the US are produced basically from there.
Is there a comparable city in America that you might relate it to in terms of it's not the biggest or not the smallest? Like, is there a parallel you could draw to help us understand what this is?
Wow, that's a good question. I would say probably like the Detroit.
Okay, so it's like mid-tier, proper urban environment.
Yes, it's very hard to draw parallels.
Not top 3 city, but a legit city.
Yeah, it's a capital city of, or like it's a capital city of the Henan province. So it's really second tier city, but it's historically important. A lot of manufacturing, a lot of farming, massive. And it's hard to draw complete parallels because the concept of suburban, like a suburb, it doesn't really exist in China. It's either mega city or countryside. And countryside is where it's super rural. It's farmers stuck in 20 years ago in terms of technology, lifestyle. But vast majority of the population, basically the entire middle class and above, live in the cities. So I will show. I think I'll share a screen a bit about just to give sort of a sense of the scale and how it compares to the U.S. cities. But let me maybe talk about sort of these specific sectors that I want to mention. There is a huge misconception I think I really want to correct here, which is, and it definitely was true before, but I'm just saying it's not true now. Chinese technology is a carbon copy or a bootleg version of US technology.
I hear this all the time. When this conversation comes up, everyone's saying, hey, they're just copying US technology. And I can't pronounce the name of the company. Huawei. Can you pronounce it for me, please?
Huawei. Yep. Which is banned by the US government. Yep.
Right. You go on their website and it looks like a clone of Apple, right? There's
Yep.
FaceTime. It's called Meet Time. The icons are almost identical,
Yep.
right? Everything top to bottom. It's Apple cloned.
Correct.
And I'm assuming Apple came first. Pretty safe assumption. And it's not subtle. This
Yep.
even all the iconography, it's like slightly changed. They're not even trying to hide it.
Yes, especially the design, like you mentioned. It's just
So it does reinforce this clone technology argument, the narrative we hear all the time. When you glance 10 seconds on the website, it's obvious.
Yep.
Okay, so
agreed. So
everyone's saying they're just cloning the technology. They can't actually make anything. We have nothing to worry about. I've heard that argument a bunch. Where do you come out on that?
I would argue that that statement is definitely truthful. Let's say for the period between early to late 90s up until 2010s, like 2015 or so. That's basically, in my own understanding, my own experience, exactly what's happening, right? US comes out with a great product, China copies it, uses own labor and technology, basically swap some of the components, but make it 50% cheaper. And that's how these companies stay competitive. What I'm trying to argue is that's no longer the case now. It is quite shocking to me, frankly, because that was my own understanding as well. That is no longer the case. The innovation cycle in China has really shortened, and you're seeing now that in specific sectors, which we'll talk about, better innovation, better quality, potentially definitely lower cost, and better customer service, all wrapped in one, in a Chinese-made product with no components outsourced. That's the part that's shocking. Like, it's not like the Toyota of the world or the German manufacturers where, in cars specifically, where they outsource, 99% of the components and they sort of do the design, and that's it. These components are made in China, and in fact, they're exported out to other different manufacturers, and they're designed in China, and they're put together in China. They're sold to Chinese consumers and also global consumers. So EVs, phones, technologies. So of course, computers, projectors, air conditioners, you name it, right? These home appliances and cars is what really shocked me the most this time. For disclaimers I mentioned previously, being running an RIA, I can't really talk about specific companies, but I strongly suggest the audience to just to go on a hunt. Maybe just do a quick Google search. What are the top EV companies in China? Oh, by the way, there's a recent Shanghai Auto Show, which is on YouTube. You can take a look, and just go on their websites and take a look at these technologies for EVs, for hybrids, for Huawei, for instance, the company you mentioned, Xiaomi, is another sort of used to be known as a copycat of US technology company. Just go on their website and look at what they offer, and specifically compare stat by stat to an iPhone or Samsung, and come to your own conclusions which one's better. And then at the end, you adjust for the price.
I guess it makes sense.
Yeah.
If you look at the last decades, we had an innovation here or other countries. Everyone went to China to build it. They developed all the factory tooling technologies, infrastructure, know-how. And the design component, which is high science often, is the most learnable in some ways because you have a generation that studies it. And then you go to your own factories and turn the speed up. That's right. So I obviously I don't know how that sort of was progressed. Maybe it makes sense that some of these technologies, designs and whatnot, were sort of espionage and sort of stolen over time, and now they have their own repertoire of knowledge. Right? That's totally possible. I have no idea. But the fact of the matter is, today's technology, today's design, and the quality of the design, right? That's the main thing. I sat in those cars myself and I experienced what it's like. It's not what you would think. It's very high quality material, very good
design features, technologies that you will see in cars that are usually in the 200 plus thousand range, in a car that's actually going to cost you 40,000 in China, and people are buying it left and right, not just in China but Middle East. Yeah.
Would you say it's on par with high-end US technology, ahead or behind? Where's your intuition telling you based on your experience? And I know you drive a Tesla at home, so you're living fairly frontier US.
Right. Yes, I've owned that Tesla since 2018. I've been a huge fan of Tesla ever since. I would say in terms of the core technology, in terms of battery, drivetrain, all these things, my argument is China is actually ahead. Not by 100 miles, but China is ahead. In terms of interior design, Chinese interior design and quality materials is on par with luxury segments in Europe and US. So think of the BMWs, the Mercedes in the above 100K range, right? But remember, in terms of cost, in terms of the actual cost of this car and vehicle, it's nowhere near. It's 30-40% of the cost of the US. So it makes for, it's a strong argument to buy these, to me, when I saw it personally as a consumer, to buy these Chinese made vehicles. If you're a European, if you're somewhere living in the Middle East, and they are buying those vehicles, if you look at the stats, how many cars they've sold, as opposed to the Tesla and even some of the Korean manufacturers.
Yeah, I was under the impression Israel, which obviously a very tech advanced country, most of their automotive comes from China at this point. That's where they're buying most of their cars. Is it, what's causing the price efficiency? Is it they've just got all the manufacturing there, they don't have to ship it because decades of developing the manufacturing sector? Or is it labor costs are lower? Why is the pricing so advantaged?
Yeah, I mean, historically, China had to basically import a lot of technologies with tariffs and a lot of components from abroad. But now everything is, as I mentioned, is manufactured and designed and sourced domestically. And then there's, of course, that labor cost component. And then the companies are there's such a competitive landscape out there. They're competing on very thin margins. So these companies are not making a lot of money, right? Versus Tesla. But if you compare them to Tesla maybe 5 years ago, then that's more comparable, even though they have better market penetration. So I think over time, it's going to get even more competitive from here. It's just, the technology is becoming commoditized at this point, and it's really competing on the thin margins, and just fascinating sector to sort of follow and watch. So that's just EVs. I mean, I felt like a little kid again this time when I was in China. Every room I walk into, I kind of just fiddle around with different things. Like, what does this do? What does that do? Because you just don't see them here in the US. Like projectors, like things like this. Just in a home compliance world, it's that to me is where the standard of living part that we talked about in China has really, really improved. Everything's automated. There's no cash anymore. You pay everything on this app called WeChat, and I didn't see a single bill or coin the whole 2 weeks I spent there, and so it's just a different lifestyle at this point. I think it's worth mentioning maybe some so going back to where we started, which is my life in China, and talk about this thing called work ethic. This is the part where I really want to make sure the audience of this pod understand is that, my experience, working so hard as a middle schooler was not an exception. That was just sort of everyone else is like, right? So if you're coming from that kind of childhood, by definition, you're going to work hard. You're trained to do it that way, right? There are no after hours. So you get it done, right? That's sort of the mentality in China. And I think if you've gone to school here in the States, and you probably met a lot of international students, and some of them from Asia, and you've probably seen their sort of work ethic and what they do, and that to me is not surprising whatsoever. So work ethic there's a real differentiator here. And why does that matter? Well, maybe when people talk about the rise of China and when people talk about the potential dominant superpower it could become in the future versus the US, I would strongly encourage, folks to look deeper and to go into the why. It's not as simple as, having a huge population and, the central government driving everything by themselves and forcing people to do certain things they don't want to do. It's not as simple as that. It's a lot of it, to me, fundamentally can be traced back to this mentality and this work ethic, which really just permeates through all different sectors, from education, early childhood to later on.
The last major thing that comes up in this conversation when I'm talking to people, and I'm no expert, but I'm infinitely curious about everything.
Yeah.
You know me and you know that. Is
Yep.
When you bring up China, everyone says, look, they have the one-child policy. They have a net aging population. It's the shape of the population based on age demographics is really imbalanced, and no society has ever survived that. Right? It's tectonic pressure. The economy is going to topple over at a certain point.
Yep.
The way most countries tend to solve those dynamics is through opening the borders for immigration.
Yep.
You're painting a very attractive picture for a quality of life that people from around the world would probably want to pursue. But I don't believe China's had very much of an open immigration policy.
Yep.
Is that something you see on the horizon to solve the population issue? Or is the population going to undermine all of this great progress? Or is there some other thing we're not seeing in this? Because this is one of the few strongholds that people use, and I'm not saying they're right or wrong, as counter arguments for why China's not going to be it.
Yeah. In fact, I share that view myself. I'm going to go back to what we've talked about many times, which is, what is the number one thing the Chinese government cares about? And that is stability. Stability first, everything else comes second. So for that reason, opening up the border and really having a sort of a similar immigration policy as the US, to me, is a last resort type of tool that the central government in China can sort of turn on. If I think that's a low probability event, but they might be forced eventually to do that. I think, based on the current policy sets, if you sort of look at what they're trying to do, is the government in China is trying to do their absolute best to turn around this, aging population and encourage people to have more kids. And there's a policy I want to mention, which is really shocking to me. I learned about it this time when I came back, is, the government has decided that the reason people are not having kids in my generation is because of education. It's just way too costly for people to have more than one kid and support them through all different schools. So what the government decided to do is outright ban all after-school activities. So classes for math, English, science, ban all of them at once across the whole country, except for sports and art, which is such a minority of classes that people would attend in my generation. So in that way, they want to basically equal the playing field and make sure the poor parents can raise just as many kids as the more rich families, right? So that's how drastic, as an example, the government is trying to turn around and have more population, at least a stabilized population. So until they exhaust all of these sort of steps, right, to try to turn around domestically without opening the border, they won't turn into immigration policy, in my opinion. But can they turn that on to save themselves? Absolutely. And if they do, and I hope I've made a good argument so far, they will attract people. If let's say, imagine you're a kid having the opportunity to choose you're from India, you're from Africa, you're from the more developing part of the world, and you say, do I go to the US? Do I go to China? 20 years ago, that wasn't a question, right? Now that's becoming more of a question. Even in my own shoes, like, would I, if I were born 20 years later, 25 years later, would I choose to come to the US again? I don't know. I frankly wouldn't know that. I would have to really think about it.
The American knee jerk there is, but you're trading your freedom, right? There's
Yeah.
this sense that, hey, look, it is arguably a capitalistic autocracy. It's not a communist state anymore.
Yep.
It's capitalism as an economy, but it all answers to kind of up to one person, right? And that's different than what you have in the States.
Yep.
So the Western sensibility is that's untenable. How do you react to that?
I first of all, having lived the second half of my life here in the States, I couldn't agree more that this freedom of everything is so important. And but I think this is a bit of a luxury. This is something I think we all have to adjust mentally, because if you're really thinking about this exact question with intellectual honesty, you have to put yourself in a mindset of a potential immigrant from developing countries. Do you care about making a living more, or do you care in that position at that time more about freedom of speech? I could tell you back, if I really try to trace back my memory at the time, all I could care about is be successful, make a living, and make my family proud, and succeed in that way. And then when I achieve that, then I worry about freedom of speech and freedom of movement, right? So to me, that's my personal view. And of course, I'm sure there's a segment of the population in the world where this is it's just a no-go from the get-go. But there's also a segment of the population that will care about that more. So care about the economic success more than anything else. And by the way, the last thing I would say is you really don't feel it that much. Growing up, this wasn't really a concept to me. Yes, the government is definitely monitoring everyone's phones, WeChat, whatever. But in your day-to-day, if your goal is not to turn over the government and start a revolution, and if your goal is just to work hard, make a living, become rich, become successful, the government encourages you to do it, and they have no reason to shut you down. But if you become like the Jack Ma of the world, and where you have billions in assets, and you're openly on a world stage criticizing the Chinese government, yes, they will take you down. Until there, it's you don't really feel it as an average citizen.
Also, from a human capital perspective, it's a false choice for some people. The U.S. isn't welcoming everybody, and they're not welcoming everybody with talent. Our immigration policies are difficult in some ways. So for folks who don't have a lot of options, the U.S. may not be on the table. And so it may be China, status quo, or other.
Yeah.
So, there are a lot of really talented, capable people around the world who are not in the U.S., who are not in a Western democracy, who are not in an advanced economy.
Yes.
And they just didn't win on that lottery, that birth lottery,
yep.
for quality of life.
Yeah.
And, rational thinking presumes a good chunk of those people would make a trade.
Precisely. And the U.S. now has the sort of the luxury to choose, right? Who we want to take in. China doesn't have to start there. China can start with more aggressive, taking in everybody, and eventually, as its problem is being solved, it can then sort of close its border gradually and choose a certain subset of the population, just like what the U.S. is doing right now. So, yeah, I this is how I would think. But the population, the aging population is a real problem. That is the strongest factor that will slow down the growth of China and prevent it from being a world dominant power.
But it sounds like they're aware of it and they're taking action. Would you do the visuals before we wrap up here?
Yes.
Just so people who are watching the YouTube version of this can see bring this to life a little bit.
Let's do it. Great. So this is my hometown. This is sort of where I grew up. And two things I will say. So first of all, let's sort of put a scale around this, right? So not sure if people can see the bottom right. There's a scale right here. It says 2 miles. And I pulled up a Manhattan map, also with the exact same scale, and just so that people can compare it, right? So this is Manhattan. It's roughly, call it 2 by 8, so 16 square kilometers. My province now, right? It's roughly about 8 by 8. Okay, so 64. So roughly 4x the size of Manhattan. And this, by the way, is just sort of the so-called the Manhattan equivalent, right? The downtown, I call it.
Right. And this is
equivalent.
not the number one city. This is
This is again,
Detroit.
Correct.
This is Detroit.
This is an important city, but it's nowhere near. It's the middle of the pack secondary city. And so people give a sense of scale there. And secondly, I want to mention here, this, if people can see, this the entire top right corner, this is about a fourth, so basically more than a Manhattan worth of the city wasn't there a decade ago. It was farmland, dirty rivers, villages, nothing. I never even visited for the first 17 years of my life. Okay, this entire top right. And in the past 4 years, so the last time I visited pre-pandemic, this portion right here, okay, this is about, I'll call it a third of that top right corner, wasn't there. Again, farmlands, dirty rivers, villages. And all of a sudden, when I visited, it became a city. It became part of the city, fully integrated with the full infrastructure built in. The size of Manhattan, okay, the size of Manhattan was built in a matter of 4 years from the ground up, from the foundation up.
In the not most important city,
correct,
in the country.
Yes,
which is a side project. They built Manhattan on the side.
Correct. Definitely not important from multiple angles. It's centered in China, but it's not on the coast. It doesn't have a lot of international population. It's just a middle of the pack secondary city. So what does it even look like? This is what it looks like. This is that exact area that I mentioned that wasn't there 4 years ago. Now it looks like this. This entire river that you're seeing is man-made. Wasn't there before. Okay, so just so that people have a sense of scale. Okay, this building right here is the same size as the MGM Grand in Vegas. I visited this building. It's a convention center. And these buildings, that you see on the side, they're all 40, 50 stories, right? So the typical building you will see in Manhattan. And as far as your eye can see, okay, this entire region was built. Surely in the last 10 years, vast majority in the last 4 years. Okay, and they're not. These are not ghost towns. So okay, that's people think, oh, these are ghost real estate people. No, everyone is living there. At night, it's fully lit on every apartment as far as you can see.
Yeah, we've heard the narrative that the government's done a top-down real estate build. There's these ghost cities. No one's there. It's a financial crisis in the making because there's no revenue against all the development costs.
Yep.
How do you reconcile that narrative?
There's definitely some of that's definitely true, right? The only thing I'm trying to say is that's not as true. It's not a full-blown depression in real estate market and these are ghost towns. That's not true. Like a lot of it happens in sort of more primary cities, Beijing, Shanghai of the world, where there's such a hype over the years and the per square footage is 2-3x in Manhattan, and there's just so much demand. So the real estate developers obviously has flooded those markets and built a lot of houses barely in the city, and a lot of people bought this real estate, and they're real ghost towns, right? But for a secondary city where the population is 20 million or more, these are properties that people own and they live in it, right? These are not sort of business buildings. These are residential buildings, vast majority of them. And people do live in them. They're not ghost towns. It's very vibrant. You walk on the street, you get a sense of that. So for those of you who are maybe planning to visit China, my biggest advice is don't go to Shanghai, don't go to Beijing, don't go to Hong Kong. These cities have been developed for decades. If you really want to get a sense of what actual life is like in China and just get a sense of the development over the past decade and get a sense of the technology and infrastructure, go to a city like this. Go to a secondary city, middle of the pack. And there are many of them out there, and just take it all in. Just, spend a few days and take it all in. So that's it. That's what I want to show on visually.
Okay. Do you want to wrap it up and leave us with a headline here?
Yes.
What did all this mean to you?
I want to talk about one last thing, and then we'll wrap it up, which is the rise of the Chinese currency. I think this is the part where it's also hugely debated in the US. And I just want to provide some real basic statistics. Okay. This is, by the way, from, I think, Reuters or Bloomberg, Bloomberg, I think. As of March this year, so a month ago, the yuan, the Chinese currency, in China's own cross-border transactions, for the first time in history, has surpassed the dollar.
Meaning people are accepting Chinese currency in a trade.
Correct.
From when they used to say, hey, pay us in dollars.
Yes, correct. I'm not talking about globally, so between US and European partners. I'm talking about between China and Chinese partners. For the first time, the yuan has transacted in more volume than the dollar. 48% of it versus the dollar, which is 47%, right? So that's just happened last month. And you see all the headlines, Argentina, Brazil, for certainly a lot of countries in the Middle East, and even France has joined this pact, or in the process of joining this pact to basically transact in RMB. And Russia, for sure, I'm not going to get into the politics, but because of the war, it used to be all dollars. Now, because of sanctions and everything, it's all in RMB now. So the yuan is taking center stage, or definitely in the process to do so, and that challenges the reserve currency status of the dollar. And will the dollar ever? My view is, will the dollar ever become a currency nobody cares about? No, it will still play a major role, especially in the West. But will Chinese yuan become a major competitor? Absolutely, especially regionally, which is such an important part of the world in terms of manufacturing, in terms of trade. And the thing to watch is energy, right? As energy gets sort of, with Saudi Arabia and all these important energy countries, do they transact in yuan or do they transact more in dollar? That's something that's an ongoing concern, I think, for us to monitor. That's it. That's the last thing I want to mention before really we wrap it up. I mean, the overall message I think I want to send here is, it is wrong to ignore and to keep the same misconceptions, to not adjust your own understanding of what China is like today, and to have the same understanding of what China is like today as if it was stuck in 20 years ago. China is not the same country. It is advancing on multiple fronts. It is posing a challenge to the West. And the last thing we should do is ignore it. So everyone should educate themselves on all these new developments, and just stay hungry. Don't be sort of content and just overall satisfied, because we will be left behind if the government and us don't do anything, don't do something about it. And watch out for the talent flow. Watch out for the immigration policy, because those will play major roles in shaping what the world is going to be like 20 years down the road.
Thank you, Chris. It was terrific.
Of course. Pleasure, Mark.
And a double reminder here for everybody. Chris already said it, but he's an SEC registered RIA, so nothing he said should be misconstrued as investment advice. Thank you for listening. This is the topic of our decade, right? How the New World Order with two superpowers in the US and China operates. How we navigate this as a country, as a people, as a world is going to be very important. It fits into the broader, multi-century narrative of autocracy versus democracy. It also fits into a more shorter-term dynamic of how we all recalibrate to this new reality, and to the extent there needs to be any sort of violence to negotiate balance of power. My great hope is that we can find a way to collaborate with these other countries, even with major differences in values that doesn't resort to war. We've had people on the podcast in the past who have informed us of some pretty terrifying statistics. 20 of the last 24 times the world superpower has changed, there's been a war. The transition from the British to the Americans in the 60s was one of the few where there was not. We were already allies at that point, just coming out of World War II. My hope is this doesn't need to escalate, and we can find a peaceful way forward that works for everybody. More to come. We'll catch you next week. Thanks for listening.